Well, thank you, and I'm really happy for the opportunity to speak to the monthly meeting tonight. As Julia said, um, many of the slides from tonight's presentation are from the Climate Reality Project, which is Al Gore's project, and it trains people on climate, but also how for speaking. Their goal is to get as many people as possible speaking about climate, and which I think is a great idea. And as you listen tonight, think about whether you might like to join a 350 Madison Speakers Bureau. I'd be really interested in getting a group of people together, particularly as we get out of COVID. There will be all sorts of service clubs and faith groups and so forth that might be interested in talks, and I think it'd be a really good way to get the word out. So tonight, I'm going to talk, I'm going to have two main themes. The first theme is the relationship between climate change and COVID-19. Now, climate change did not cause COVID-19, obviously, but there are strong relationships. First of all, the fossil fuel pollution that leads to climate change also increases susceptibility to COVID-19. Climate change caused natural disasters, help spread COVID-19 and other infectious diseases. Climate change makes future pandemics more likely. The same policy solutions that could help abate climate change would help economic recovery from COVID-19. And finally, both COVID-19 and climate change are crises on an international scale, which require coordinated science-based solutions. And these are themes I'm going to be coming back to. You'll hear these during the presentation. The other theme of my talk tonight is the relationship between climate change and environmental racism. Climate change, as I'm sure we all know, disproportionately endangers the poor and people of color, both in the US and around the world. And you're going to see lots of examples of that tonight. So to get started, the fact is that we're spewing 152 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into the atmosphere every 24 hours. And as I'm sure you know also, the largest source of global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels. And this graph shows the number of metric tons of carbon burned and put into the atmosphere each year. And you could see that right around the time of, right after World War II, it started to grow, and it's just grown sharply, and it's not abating. So what's the result? The result is that 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2001. And the hottest of all have been the last 5 years. And from what I've read, it seems that 2020 is going to take its place in this group as well. So surface temperatures have been rising. Ocean temperatures have been rising just as fast as surface temperatures. And the results are heat waves, fires, polar melting and sea level rise, droughts, and storms. I want to just talk real briefly about each of these. Let's start with heat. Temperatures have been rising to amazing levels, frequently in parts of Asia and Africa, up in 125, 127 degrees. It was over 130 degrees in Death Valley a couple of weeks ago. So who's the most vulnerable to heat? The poor and the homeless, elderly, infants and children, people with pre-existing medical conditions, the mentally ill, and agricultural workers and people who have to work outside. We tend to take for granted our air conditioning, but most people in the world don't have that. Storms. Storms are getting heavier and much more intense with climate change. And we've all heard about the big storm events in the Caribbean, on the Gulf Coast. So I thought I would talk about a storm earlier this year, which I know I hadn't heard of, and I doubt that many of you did. Super Cyclone Amphan. It took place in this area called the Sundarbans on the border of India and Bangladesh, which is one of the poorest areas in the world. And this is what it looked like there after that storm in Bangladesh. The Sundarbans is finished. Amphan has killed it. All of our crops, even our trees, have been destroyed. What will we do? And going back to our theme of COVID, this is a cyclone evacuation camp from that storm. We are facing a dual challenge of cyclone in the time of COVID-19. Imagine the impact of climate change induced storms and disasters in helping to spread pandemics as well. At the same time, there's major storms. There's more evaporation from the earth as well, and major groundwater aquifers are losing water all over the world. So how does that impact? Well, here's just one of many, many examples. More than half of Zimbabwe's people are suffering from a shortage of food due primarily to drought. Take that and multiply it all over the world, and you're seeing the pain that climate change is causing, and disproportionately it's impacting people who were very poor to start with. We're all familiar with the fires in California. This is just this picture is from August of this year. You also probably heard about the terrible fires in Australia where the smoke went clear around the globe. But here's some fires that you may not have heard as much about. Siberia, the boreal forests in the Arctic region are burning. By early May 2020, wildfires in Siberia had burned over 5 million acres. Now, why is that so significant? It's significant because the Northern Hemisphere's peatlands store more carbon than all the world's rainforests combined. And with the fires, that carbon is being released. This map shows all the fires detected in the boreal forests just in about a 2-month period last year. And the area is expected to vastly increase and is threatening to turn boreal forests, which have been carbon sinks, into net carbon emitters. And that is extraordinarily frightening to think that that's going to happen. We're all aware that Greenland's ice is melting 4 times faster than originally thought, and that the South Pole too, the Antarctica, is also melting very rapidly. And this, of course, leads to rising sea levels and puts whole populations at risk. These are the 10 cities most at risk in terms of population of sea level rise. And you'll see that Miami is number 9. Most of the cities are in Asia, and these are big cities. Kolkata, which is also called Kolkata, India, Mumbai. These are cities with tens of millions of people living in them. Where are these people going to go? And it's not just cities. Again, here's Bangladesh. Flooding from sea level rise, storm surges, and tidal surges are all leading to increased soil salinity in Bangladesh and in other parts of the world as well, with making agriculture difficult or impossible. So key global systems are at risk because of climate change, and disruptions to these systems can lead to political or societal instability. Food supply, water, and global health. Let's talk first about water. How does climate change affect water? This chart shows the various ways that it impacts water, but briefly, it reduces the supply of fresh water and increases the demand for water. Water scarcity already affects more than 40% of the world's population. And going back to our theme of COVID, lack of running water for hand washing and sanitation increases the risk of contracting COVID-19 and other diseases. Food supply. So how does climate change impact food supply? It hurts it in many ways, with drought, disease, heat, more pests, fires, lack of water, or flooding. This chart shows the projected yield declines for each 1 degree centigrade of warming. So corn, wheat, rice, and soy collectively make up 2/3 of human caloric intake. And you'll see that the yields of corn goes down more than 7%, wheat 6%, rice 3%, and soy 3%. So the amount of food we'll be able to produce will go down as the world warms. And here's another impact on food that is more another thing that surprised me and is more unusual, but it's very real. Parts of Africa, India, and the Middle East are experiencing the worst locust swarms in decades. And as you know, locusts can come into a field and they, in just minutes, they could eat a year's worth of crops. This is what the Secretary General of the UN said about the locust plague. There's a link between climate change and the unprecedented locust crisis plaguing Ethiopia and East Africa. Warmer seas mean more cyclones, generating the perfect breeding ground for locusts. This is getting worse by the day. These are the kinds of things we may not think about all the time, but they're very, very real. Now let's talk about global health. How does climate change affect global health? All these ways. Heat stress, air pollution, food, extreme weather events, infectious disease, allergens. I'm just going to talk about a couple of these. First of all, air pollution. The air pollution that causes climate change kills 9 million people every year. And this is an area where our theme of environmental racism really comes into play. COVID-19 death rates in the US are 8% higher in counties with higher than average fine particle air pollution. A study of 324 cities in China found a 15 to 22% increase in COVID-19 cases in areas with elevated levels of nitrogen dioxide and fine particle pollution. Another impact on climate, on human health, is that as the climate changes and people's land turns to desert, or they run out of water, or they're flooded, they have to forge more and more into the wilderness where they haven't been before, and go into the Earth's remaining wild places. And as a result, 5 new infectious diseases are emerging on average each year. And of those, 75% are what's called zoonotic diseases, meaning that they're transmitted from animals to humans. And as you know, COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease that jumped from animals to humans. So, the Poor People's Campaign lists ecological devastation as one of the primary evils. These are the 10 counties in the United States that are considered to be most vulnerable to climate disaster, according to the CDC. And the population in these counties is 81% minority on the average. 8 of the 10 Louisiana parishes with the highest death rates from COVID-19 are in the state's Cancer Alley, which is the area near the big oil refineries on the Gulf Coast. Overall, African Americans are 3 times as likely to die from particulate air pollution as the overall population. And the percentage of US African American children suffering from asthma is nearly twice that of white children, and their death rate from asthma is 10 times higher. We talked about the theme of the relationship between climate change and environmental racism. There you have it. And it's not just humans that are being harmed. We are now at risk of losing up to 50% of all land-based species in this century. So, what's the cost of carbon? The number 1 threat to the global economy. So now that everyone is thoroughly depressed, we'll get into some good news. One piece of good news is that conventional energy stocks are rapidly becoming the worst investments. Energy has been the worst performer since the US bull stock market began more than a decade ago. And this graph shows the blue line is the S&P 500 since 2010, and the red line is the S&P 500 Energy Sector Index. So if you own energy stocks, you might want to get rid of them. Energy sector returns. This shows that clean energy companies have had a 60% increase in returns since 2017. And fossil fuel companies have had their returns go down 12%. So the writing's on the wall. I think the end of fossil fuel energy is rapidly coming. This shows annual US consumption of coal between 1970 and 2020. And the green line is US consumption of renewables. And they're pretty much at parity. And we all got, we got some great news here in Wisconsin this week that the big Oak Creek coal plant's going to be shut down. So things are changing, and that's good news. The divestment movement is really growing. There's been $11 trillion worldwide of institutions like banks, pension funds, and universities divesting from fossil fuels. And it's really taken off since 2014. So in the last 6 years, there's been a 22,000% increase in the amount of divestment. If these companies don't have the money to operate, they won't be able to operate. And the capacity for renewable energy has been growing. This shows the curve of the growth of wind capacity from 1980 to 2019, a very steep curve. And at the same time, if you look at the cost of wind energy, it's dropping precipitously. The same thing follows with solar. This is the number of solar installations worldwide, growing extremely sharply. And this is another area where we got good news this week, that there's going to be a huge solar farm built right here in Dane County that will serve 30,000 houses. And the cost of solar cells is dropping. It was $79.40 a watt in 1976, and now it's 20 cents a watt. Around the world, renewable energy made up 80% of all net new electricity capacity added globally in 2019. And this I find really interesting and encouraging. This is in South Sudan, a solar panel on a home there. And low initial costs make small solar systems affordable in developing countries. And I love this picture. These are solar-powered laptops in Sierra Leone. And it reminds me of telephones, where in many countries, they just skipped over landlines altogether and went straight to cell phones. And I think there are places where they may be able just to skip over fossil fuels and go directly to solar and wind. So in 2014, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than new coal and gas plants in approximately 1% of the world. By 2019, only 5 years later, solar and wind was the cheapest source of new electricity in 2/3 of the world. And it's projected that by 2024, solar and wind will be the cheapest new electricity worldwide. And it's great for jobs as well. So the job category solar installer is forecast to be the fastest growing job category in the US through 2028. And the job category wind turbine service technician will be second. The growth in electric vehicles is also it's really growing rapidly in many parts of the world, and these are countries that are planning to totally phase out fossil fuel vehicles, and the state of California is planning to do so as well. So I think the end is beginning for fossil fuel vehicles. And cities around the country are committing to 100% renewable energy. And we are all interested to see on this map, Madison, Middleton, and Monona. It should also include, it doesn't, but it should include Fitchburg and Dane County. And I think a lot of people in this audience deserve a lot of credit for having those communities on the map. Now, of course, commitment is one thing. There are relatively few that have already achieved 100% renewable electricity, but it shows that it's possible. And that's what 350 Madison is committed to really working with our communities to get them to that point where they fulfill on their commitments. Similarly, over 240 global companies have pledged to convert to renewable energy. So, summing up, looking historically, there was the agricultural revolution that we've all learned about with farming and centralized food production. Then there was the industrial revolution, which had the invention and use of power-driven machines. And then more recently, there was the digital revolution, which totally changed our use of information and communications technologies.
Trying to get people enrolled in recovery programs when they don't have a home is very tough. So we continue really focusing our strategies.
Excuse me, I hear someone talking there. And then finally, there's the where we are now is the sustainability revolution. This is the new revolution we are coming to. Reorganization of the economy around new forms of zero emission, healthy, equitable, sustainable growth. So, hope we've gotten some what seems like promising news about a vaccine, and maybe within the next several months we'll be at a point where we could rebuild our economy from COVID-19. And as we do that, we're at a crossroads. We could do it with business as usual. So what will that imply? Pandemics will become increasingly likely. Pollution will increase the susceptibility to contagious disease. Climate change and environmental encroachment will trigger new zoonotic diseases. Climate-caused natural disasters will promote disease spread. And there will be continued environmental racism, with the poor and people of color suffering the most. But it's not inevitable. As we rebuild our economy, we could commit to also fighting climate change. This will help us control the risk of future pandemics. There'll be less pollution, so people will be able to fight off respiratory illnesses. Less environmental encroachment, so reducing the risk of pathogen spread. Fewer natural disasters that could accelerate pandemics and other illness. And there will be climate and social justice with increased equity and fair outcomes for all. So in closing, I ask you to join those who are using their voices, their votes, and their choices to fight for their future, their community, and their world. And use your voice, your vote, your choices. Speak truth to power like your world depends on it. Because your world quite literally depends on it. And thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then we could have some questions. And I encourage you, if you would like to be able to give talks to this like this, come also to the breakout, and we could talk about that. So with that, any questions?
Yes, thank you. I'm hearing from the host, Julia, that we have time for one question. And there's been several, so let me just think about this. So have we as 350 been talking to other groups around the state about this climate change and reality, the reality project, to other groups? And it seems like it might be a good time to do that with Zoom. And also, are there companies in Wisconsin that are alternative energy companies that we can buy stock in or support or, purchase?
There
you know
probably
of?
are people that know more about that than I do. I know that at a monthly meeting a year or two ago, there actually was a representative of a company that specialized in investments in green companies, but that is not my area of specialization, unfortunately.
Okay, okay, thank you. And maybe you could just say for a minute or two, what was it like doing the climate reality project training, and the cost, and is it virtual now, and are they still having trainings now and that type of thing?
Yeah, the way they used to do it, they went to different cities, a few different cities a year, and so I did it in Minneapolis, and it was free, except I had to pay my own accommodations, and travel obviously, but it was free, and there were like 1,000 or 1,200 people in this huge room at a convention center, and it was 3 days long, and it was a pretty amazing experience. There were people from all over the world.
Hmm.
But my understanding now is they've switched to a virtual model. I think it's a few days on Zoom. I think it's still free. You have to apply, but I don't think they're real. I think it's, if you want to go, I think you could go, and I think it's pretty worthwhile.
Great. Thank you so much, Gail. We really, really, really appreciate it, and it was great to see your talk and see everything you have to offer. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.